Good morning, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Brett Perlman, the CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, and today is the second day of our Houston Low Carbon Energy Summit. This year we've added the word innovation to the title because, as you will see today, innovation will be the key to achieving our climate change goals. Last week, for those of you who missed it, we talked about why Houston is well positioned to become a leader not only in oil and gas, but in the energy transition. We unveiled our report that we created with the University of Houston, in which we identified several areas in which Houston is uniquely positioned, given our physical assets, our intellectual capabilities, our amazing group of energy companies, and our deep bench of talented executives and engineers. We also heard from those companies and community leaders who are in the vanguard of working and making Houston a leader in low carbon energy. And finally, we close with two interesting keynotes. Jules Kortenhorst from the Rocky Mountain Institute explained why winning slowly is the same as losing in the energy transition, and so why we need to accelerate the pace of change. And Amy Jaffe, formerly the Baker Institute and now at Tufts Climate Policy Lab, explained why it's unlikely that oil and gas will be the sole driver of Houston's economy in the same way it's been in the past. Today, we're turning our attention to the second question: how do we get this done? How do we create an energy innovation ecosystem? And why is Houston, until recently, which has not been known as a technology hub, the logical place to create this type of innovation? Now, some of you may be asking, why is innovation so important for addressing our energy future? To frame this discussion, I'd like to ask Jetta Wong, who is a thought leader in energy and policy, to set the stage. Jetta served as a presidential appointee in the Obama administration for 4 years at the Department of Energy, where she was devoted to expanding DOE's lab-to-market initiatives. At DOE, she launched and led the National Laboratory Impact Initiative, as well as establishing the Office of Technology Transitions to ensure long-term dedication to the commercial impact of DOE's $14 billion R&D portfolio. She also chaired the White House's National Science and Technology Council's Lab to Market Initiative, which is focused on creating economic impact from federally funded R&D. She's currently a senior fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, where she leads research projects on tech transfer, commercialization, and energy innovation, and is an advisor to the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. Jetta, thanks for joining us. I couldn't think of a better one to get us started, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and very anxious to hear what you have to say.
All right, well, let me share my screen quickly. See here. There we go. Well, thank you so much to Brett and everyone at the Center for Houston's Future for inviting me here today. It is very exciting to be with everyone. First, let me say that I am excited to be here to help figure out how to create an energy innovation ecosystem in Houston. As Brett said, my name is Jetta Wong, and I'm a senior fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And today I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework on how to build that innovation ecosystem. And as Brett said, it all starts with innovation. So if I can get my slide to forward there. All right, so I always think about innovation as doing things differently. And that is, and it's not something that comes about easily. What's really easy to do is the same thing over and over again. But innovative products and new technologies come from many different partnerships and collaborations where people bring ideas together. Yet we all envision some kind of lone inventor in her garage coming up with the next big thing, and that's just not how it happens. Think about it. Bill Gates had Paul Allen. Steve Jobs had Steve Wozniak, and many people would say a few fabled trips to Xerox PARC. Larry Page and Sergey Brin came from Stanford and were nurtured by Silicon Valley's icons. What is great about the United States is that innovation is built into the DNA of everyone here, and we can all come together to get things done and to build new opportunities through innovation. Everyone has the opportunity to innovate because we have the scientific and technical infrastructure to spur innovation to solve our biggest challenges. Whether it is flying or trying to fly, like in this picture here, building cars, refining oil, or creating the atom bomb, we have been leaders in collaborative science and technology that has spurred economic growth in our country. And this is because the United States does a great job at funding the basic science and early stage energy R&D that creates the inputs into innovation. And this is just a snapshot of the US Department of Energy's 2019 budget request. We put billions of dollars into early stage discovery science and the invention of new widgets. What we know about, though, the process of technological innovation from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology is that while the US government is good at invention, it's not really great at the later stages of innovation, such as translation, adoption, and diffusion. And in fact, the government needs other actors, such as the private sector, to help pull technologies to the market. The private sector is the one that makes the ultimate decision about what products can be brought into the market. So you might ask yourself, what is the private sector doing to develop new technology? And people are probably pretty familiar with this chart. The first thing is to know that the energy sector puts very little money into R&D, way less than other sectors. And the second thing to remember is that the private sector is not really interested in funding early stage science because it's just too risky. So they need to see a return on their investment, and they're not going to get that from early stage science. This significant bifurcation in funding and interest with government on one side and the private sector on the other side creates what many people call the valley of death, or as I like to put it, many valleys of death. The Energy Futures Initiative, led by former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, and IHS Markit, led by Daniel Yergin, released a report last year which notes that success in crossing the valley of death requires the alignment of many players who bring different skills, experiences, knowledge, and resources to the innovation process. It is this alignment that is so difficult to achieve, and which we need to achieve to really build an innovation ecosystem. On one side of this graphic, you have labs and universities and scientists which have no incentive to take technologies to the market or to engage with the private sector to commercialize technology. On the other side, you have the private sector players that are engaged in the later stages of adoption and diffusion. But to get them to engage, they must believe that there will be demand for an innovation or a new product before they're ever willing to invest at any level that will help take a technology through the valley of death and into the market. To develop new clean energy technology, especially in the hard science space, I'm not talking about software, we need to be able to prototype, test, validate, and probably test again and prototype again. And this can take years, sometimes decades, to develop new technology. And you've actually heard quite a bit about this valley of death and all the obstacles that it takes. In fact, when you hear a news story about how difficult it is to speed up the development of a new vaccine, you're hearing about all the obstacles in the valley of death. It usually takes 10 to 15 years to just get approval for a new vaccine. It takes many different partners and collaborators to develop this vaccine. The government is involved, scientists, the private sector, the public sector through clinical trials, regulators, manufacturers, and many others are needed to align all of these players for the commercialization of a new vaccine. And to speed up this process, the government is working in coalitions and collaboratively with the private sector to develop a vaccine faster. Through, for example, the Foundation for the National Institutes for Health, 5 government entities and over a dozen private sector partners are working to develop a promising vaccine through its active partnership. To bridge the valley of death and to accelerate the development of this important technology, we need the US to leverage the best of the government and the best and speed of the private sector and many other collaborators. And we need to do the same thing to address climate change and to develop clean energy technologies. And so some of the components that are required in the development of new technology are things like training for entrepreneurs, the availability of research funding, lab facilities, and business skills. We also need to tie together mentors and investors and manufacturers to assure, again, that we're aligning across the innovation cycle to really overcome technical and financial barriers. And one way to do this is through regional energy innovation ecosystems. We heard from Brookings Institute, which puts together this great map that has several different ecosystems across the country, the Energy Futures Initiative, as well as Michael Porter from Harvard, that regional energy innovation ecosystems have many of the components to develop innovative technologies. But they're different. Many of them have different energy challenges, different regulations, and different innovation resources that can be brought together to solve technical grand challenges and strengthen local economies. They can also have less bureaucracy than a national organization that is working in the clean energy space. They're on the ground, they know what their barriers are, and they know how to achieve them quickly. But some regions don't have all the right players to take technologies to the market, especially technical players. Each region is different, and so when looking at how to develop an ecosystem, you can break down these players and resources into 8 different categories. These categories were developed by the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator when they were developing their innovation center and have been used by other communities across the country. All of these components come together to support the rapid commercialization of clean energy technologies. So today, you're going to hear from the academic community, which can supply sources of ideas, but also can help train entrepreneurs and provide facilities and labs to do their prototyping. You're also going to hear from amazing incubators and accelerators that help startups access funds and engage with the private sector, identify leaders and champions, which also can help them develop new policy reforms, which often lead to new markets, something that any entrepreneur really wants. And one area that I'm particularly excited about is the role of philanthropy in supporting public-private partnerships and these regional innovation ecosystems. So philanthropy and philanthropic groups generally focus on early stage science and technology. And thankfully, facilitated organizations like the Science Philanthropy Alliance are helping to grow this basic science space. The Alliance reported $2.3 billion were raised in 2017 for basic science. And this is a 40% increase from 2015. Around the same time, philanthropic climate and energy funding has also grown. All of these funds in the climate and energy space, only $11 million over a 4-year period was spent on low carbon R&D and technology development. We need to see more funding in this space. And this could change. So to hear how, make sure to stick around for the role of facilitators and foundations panel at 1:15. And with that, you have a framework for the commercialization of new technology and regional innovation ecosystems. And I will hand it over to you, Brett.
Well, thanks, Jetta. That was really great. And I think a really good kickoff for what the conference is going to be about. What I'd like to do in the remaining time for this keynote address is to just spend a few minutes perhaps talking a little bit how some of the points you made will be, that we'll see some of those as themes during the conference. And so I'm going to share my screen here. And let's see here. And what I'd like to do is just talk about 5 themes that we're going to be discussing today. And very similar to what Jetta just told us. First, we're going to talk about why innovation is the key to solving climate change. We're going to talk about some of the priorities for clean tech innovation. We're going to talk a little bit about why I think that Houston and the state of Texas can lead in energy innovation and how we've done this in the past and why this might be a model for what we might do in the future. We're going to then talk about, as Jetta told us, why energy innovation takes a village. And then finally, we're going to talk about how all this gets done. And we're going to have a really interesting chat with former NASA astronaut Franklin Chang Diaz towards the end of the day. And I hope you'll stay around for that talk. It's really going to be an amazing discussion of not only what's gone on in human spaceflight, but also the work that Franklin is doing in terms of a mission to Mars, and what he's doing in terms of addressing climate change. And so I think throughout the day, you're going to hear a little bit of all these themes in each of the panels. And so I'd like to kind of illustrate, just to get us started, some of these points. To do this, I think, and Jetta mentioned this in terms of vaccines, I'd like to start with this quote from Bill Gates from a couple years ago, when he sort of tied this idea of drug discovery and climate change together through this idea of talking about the miracle of vaccines and what they can do in terms of addressing deadly diseases. Now, this was written in 2014, but obviously Bill Gates was way ahead of his time because this is what we're experiencing today. But he also went on to say that the same type of innovation is needed when it comes to clean energy, that we need breakthroughs that are just as miraculous. And just like vaccines, these clean energy miracles don't happen by accident. But that today, neither the private sector nor the government is making anywhere near the scale of investments needed to produce these breakthroughs. So that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the energy miracle that we need through innovation to make that happen. And while it may seem like it is miraculous, I think the other way that he's using the word miracle is that this can happen. This is things that are within our capabilities, but it's something that we need all to work together on. So in order to reach our goals of net zero by 2050, which is a lot of what we've been talking about, we're going to need innovation to drive that sort of carbon reduction. And this chart here is an estimate by the Department of Energy a number of years ago as to whether the existing innovation programs that DOE sponsors and what Jetta was talking about are sufficient today to meet those goals. And as you can see, if we were to just use our existing budget, we would be able to reduce in the US our carbon emissions by about 23%. And even if we were to double that budget, as some have suggested, that would get us another 15%, but not enough to get us to the net zero goal. So how do we get to that net zero goal? We simply can't fund our way out of this problem. We need to have an innovation ecosystem in order to bring everybody together. The federal government isn't going to be able to do this alone. The other point that I think to be made here is that this is becoming a global competitiveness issue. Other countries are not standing still. The US ranks, as you can see, in just the middle of the pack, behind places like Switzerland and Hungary in terms of the percentage of government funding we spend on R&D. And so we're going to need to have a step up our game, both in terms of our funding for R&D, but also in terms of creating this ecosystem in order to solve this challenge. And I think it's really sort of a dual challenge. It's not only reducing our carbon emissions, but it's also in using energy innovation as a tool to solve the global competitiveness problem. Because if you think about what we're dealing with climate change, it's not enough to solve the problem in your own region or in your own area. We have to solve this as a global problem. And so the opportunity here is really to think about what we can do to develop the technologies that are going to allow us not only to reduce our emissions in the US, but to be able to sell those goods and services across the world. So this is not only a challenge, but it's an opportunity for us to be innovative and to come up with solutions that we can offer to the world. Now, in terms of what we ought to be doing for our priorities, There was a recent report released by the Energy Policy Center at Columbia University called Energizing America, and it identified 10 technology pillars, places where we can innovate faster in order to reach our climate change goals. The International Energy Administration Agency, looked at the similar list of priorities and found that in 40 of 46 areas that they identified, we weren't going fast enough. And so there's a need to continue to evolve our priorities in terms of clean energy innovation. Now, as I mentioned last week, we released a study that we had done with the University of Houston. And as you can see, that study addressed seven of those areas. We addressed in terms of where we might, in Houston, start to think about energy innovation. We looked at 4 specific areas. We looked at carbon capture, we looked at hydrogen, we looked at low carbon grid, and we looked at circular economy. And what we found is that in terms of each of these 4 areas, Houston has the potential not only to create new industries, but to be a leader in terms of developing technology for export. So in carbon capture, we really have a real opportunity to use the assets that we have on the ground today to start to reduce and solve our climate change problem. But doing that, I think the work pointed out, will only be the first step. We have to be able to innovate and to get the additional reductions in carbon dioxide in order to meet our net zero goal. In hydrogen, we found that there are opportunities to take our existing assets and basically create an entirely new industry by moving those what are called gray assets, basically that emit CO2, and converting them into blue assets by capturing that CO2 and either sequestering it or using it for other applications such as enhanced oil recovery. And if we were to do that, we would create new opportunities in transportation and perhaps in energy storage that would allow us to leverage these. And these things are things that we can do and then export and show the world how to do it. In terms of low carbon grid, our studies show that we're already a leader in wind and solar, but by leveraging our competitive energy market, we can accelerate the growth in low cost renewables, energy storage, and then move to green hydrogen, which is the next step, which is using renewable energy to electrolyze water and produce hydrogen. And that would require additional technology innovation. And then finally, in plastics recycling, we showed that we can eliminate all plastic waste by taking advantage of our existing plastic manufacturing facilities and low carbon energy to innovate with advanced recycling technologies. And so I think what we've done is not only identify the places where Houston can reduce its carbon emissions, but also the places where we can lead. So that's the second theme we're going to see in this conference today. How do we start to take these technology pillars and how do we start to drive them through the innovation process that Jetta identified? The third theme is the theme that we can actually do this today, and we've done it in the past in Texas in wind and solar. They are great case studies of how to innovate and then how to drive that innovation to market. And so here you see 2 examples of learning curves that show the reduction in cost for both solar and wind and how those costs have come down so dramatically over time. And what we've seen in Texas, and people don't, I think, know this, is that because of that, we've become a leader in non-carbon electricity generation. So this is an example of where as we start to innovate and these costs come down and these technologies become scalable, we can lead in Texas. And a lot of this work is because of the market that we created. And as you can see, and this is a surprising picture to many people, we actually have more non-carbon electric generation than California. And so we have already demonstrated that we can be a leader in non-carbon electricity generation with wind and solar. And so this is really the opportunity for us to be the leader as we start to think about these other areas that we've identified, such as in hydrogen or CCUS. The fourth theme, and Jetta touched on this, and we'll be discussing this throughout the day, and so I want to kind of lay out a framework in a little bit more detail on how the day is going to go, is this idea of energy innovation and why it takes a village to do this. That this is a system, some people call this hard tech, and not only because it deals with the creation of devices and new materials, but because this is actually hard to do. And so it really requires this innovation system that really goes from basic R&D through applied research, through development, demonstration, deployment, and scaling up, and then requires market pull. It requires policy in order to make this work. And so today we're going to have panels that discuss each of those. Our first panel is going to start with a discussion by some of our leaders at our state universities on a basic and applied research. And so we've asked Joe Powell, who you'll be hearing from shortly, from Shell, who's the chief scientist at Shell Oil, to lead a discussion with some of his colleagues from the academic research institutions on how they're thinking about basic and applied research and how R&D might be funded in the state. Our second panel is going to focus on accelerators and incubators. And as many of you know, we've really done quite a bit of work in this area over the last few years. And so Harvin Moore from Houston Exponential is going to lead us in a discussion with several of the leaders in the field of acceleration and incubation on some of the exciting things that are going on in Houston in this space. And we'll probably have, I don't want to steal the thunder, but we may have an interesting announcement to make in that space as well. And then we'll turn our attention to capital markets. And capital markets really span the entire value stream here. And Liz McGinley is going to moderate a discussion on how the capital markets play a role in financing all these types of systems, and whether the existing systems of raising funds really fit the energy transition, this energy innovation space. And then finally, we're going to hear a panel that's going to talk about market pull and technology push. And how do we start to facilitate and push this, this system in a way, and what are some of the unique things that we can do here in Texas to do that. And I think that will be a really interesting panel to bring all of this together. And then finally, we'll conclude the day with Franklin Chang Diaz, discussion with Franklin on what I'm calling Mission Possible. Now, Franklin is uniquely situated to discuss this as a former NASA astronaut. He flew as many space shuttle missions as anyone out there, and holds the record for that. But he's also a CEO and inventor. He's working on a new technology, a new rocket engine, plasma rocket engine, basically to take men to Mars. And in Costa Rica, where he's from, he is working on a hydrogen infrastructure. And so Franklin is really uniquely qualified to talk both about solving climate change and sending men to Mars. And so I think you'll find his discussion a really interesting one. So please stick around for that at the end of the day. So we have a full agenda today, and hopefully that will give you a framework for how all of this fits together and why we've made the selections we have in terms of the speakers that we've selected. There were many, many more that we could have selected in the ecosystem here in Houston. And so I think what you're going to see today is that we do have a very robust ecosystem that we're developing, but we still have a lot of work to do to make this a reality. And so that's what we're here to discuss today. I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of our sponsors, and you see them here. We've really gotten great support for this conference from a number of companies and law firms who have been very generous, and foundations who have been very generous in sponsoring the conference. I did want to make a couple of quick announcements. One of our sponsors, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Group, is offering their newest ebook called Hydrogen Powering the Net Zero Future, the technologies to get us there for download. So see the link in the chat. And then I also wanted to mention a conference that's coming up that is being put together by Doug Lewin, who has been very helpful, is at both at the Energy Foundation and is working on the Texas Energy Summit. And that conference, which is going to be spread over 5 afternoons in November 12th, 10th through 12th, and 17th through 18th, will bring together organizations, academics, businesses, and governmental entities to really talk more about the policies that can advance the low emissions future for Texas. So this conference isn't focusing that much on policy. We're really focusing on the ecosystem. But if you're interested in hearing about what policies we need to put in place, the conference that Doug is sponsoring would be a great way to do this. And in fact, that conference is in its 17th year. And if you want to register, please visit texasenergysummit.com to register. You can also apply for a scholarship to attend at no charge if you're a governmental institution or nonprofit organizations. And then returning to our event at hand, please feel free to share today's summit on social media. The center is located at Future Houston on Twitter, and our hashtags are at CHFE Energy Future, our hashtag low carbon innovation. And so with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break, get reorganized for our first panel. So stick around. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Thanks very much.